The baby boomers grew up in an America that looked safe and steady, where kids roamed freely. Neighbors shared coffee on porches, and family routines seemed set in stone. Childhood felt wide open, stretching across neighborhoods, empty fields, and streets where cars passed slowly and rarely. Parents sent their children out the door in the morning and expected them back at dusk, never worrying too much about where they wandered in between. What seemed like simple trust in kids was really part of a larger way of life, one rooted in faith that the world outside the front door was safe. Communities were tight-knit, and people believed in one another. Families left their doors unlocked at night, confident that neighbors were watching out for each other. A knock on the door was more likely to bring a borrowed cup of sugar than a stranger with bad intentions. That sense of belonging defined the baby boomer childhood, shaping a generation that felt secure in its freedom. Life moved at a slower pace, and the bonds of community stitched people together in ways that today feel almost impossible to recreate. The habits of daily life reflected that freedom. Kids rode their bikes everywhere, often without helmets, racing down hills and skidding into gravel with little concern for scrapes or falls. Play was rough and tumble, unsupervised, and often risky by today's standards. Whether it was climbing trees, building forts, or riding wagons down steep driveways, danger was part of the adventure, and parents rarely hovered nearby to intervene. Cuts and bruises were seen as lessons, not warnings. Even the way families handled household routines spoke to a different time. Burning trash in backyard barrels was a normal part of life. The smell of smoke drifting across fences wasn't too unusual. It was just how waste was managed before recycling programs or environmental laws stepped in. It's hard to imagine today, when even a small bonfire in many neighborhoods requires permission. To the baby boomers, it was simply another ritual of everyday life. What held it all together was the unspoken understanding that people belonged to their communities. Children belonged to the streets where they played. Neighbors belonged to each other through trust, and families belonged to the rhythms of town life. Safety was assumed, even when habits carried risks that later generations would no longer accept. The combination of freedom and belonging defined the era, creating memories that still shape how baby boomers look back on their youth. Yet those habits were never built to last. Change was coming, pushed by technology, shifting values, and the realities of a faster world. What once felt steady and permanent slowly began to slip away, reshaping the habits that had defined a generation. But those habits didn't stay unchanged. America's way of living was about to shift. Frozen dinners, TV trays, and drive-ins promised to save time, but they also rewired family life. In the years after World War II, convenience became the new American ideal. Families were busier, suburbs were expanding, and technology promised to make life easier. For baby boomers, growing up in this environment meant seeing old traditions give way to new habits that felt modern, exciting, and practical, even as they quietly reshaped the way people lived together. One of the biggest shifts arrived in the form of frozen dinners. Packaged neatly in aluminum trays, they could be placed straight into the oven and ready within minutes. Suddenly, the long family meal cooked from scratch gave way to quick fixes. Children ate chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie, all from a single tray, while mothers who had long carried the burden of daily cooking welcomed the time saved. Yet what seemed like progress also meant fewer nights gathered around a table and more dinners eaten in front of the glowing television set. Television itself became central to this new rhythm. Families bought TV trays so children could sit with their meals in front of the screen, watching shows that defined the decade. The living room replaced the dining room as the heart of family time. It was a cultural shift that made eating less about conversation and more about entertainment. What had once been a daily ritual of sharing stories and passing food became something faster and quieter, guided by the schedule of primetime television. Drive-ins only added to the trend. Restaurants with car hops serving burgers and milkshakes made eating out fun, casual, and affordable for families. Teenagers flocked to drive-in theaters, where double features played on giant outdoor screens while friends crammed in the cars. These habits made food and entertainment inseparable, shaping how baby boomers saw leisure. The restaurant no longer required tablecloths or waiters. It was about convenience, speed, and freedom. Food itself was changing in other ways. Soda, candy, and processed snacks became everyday staples, marketed heavily to kids and easily available in every corner store. There were few regulations about sugar, caffeine, or nutrition, and parents rarely questioned whether these habits were harmful. What mattered most was that they were easy, cheap, and satisfying. To the children of the era, a bottle of cola or a candy bar wasn't an indulgence, it was part of daily life. Today, those habits feel outdated, even unhealthy. Nutrition labels, portion sizes, and school guidelines now shape how families eat. Sugary drinks are restricted in schools. Advertising to children is heavily monitored, and the idea of feeding kids frozen meals every night draws criticism. Convenience still dominates, but it comes packaged with more caution and concern for long-term health. For baby boomers, these changes marked the beginning of a shift away from the slow, home-centered traditions of their parents. Food was no longer just nourishment. It was entertainment, speed, and freedom. That convenience became part of their identity, even as later generations worked to regulate its effects. But convenience didn't just change when Americans ate it, changed how they shopped. Woolworth's lunch counters, Sears catalogs, and soda fountains, these chains felt like home before rules reshaped them. For baby boomers, big-name stores were not faceless corporations, but familiar places woven into daily life. The five and dime on Main Street knew your family, the clerk behind the counter recognized your name, and even national chains still felt like neighborhood spots. They offered modern convenience, but in a way that remained personal, warm, and connected. One of the most surprising habits from that time was how casually children could run errands that today would be impossible. It wasn't too unusual for a young boy or girl to walk into the corner store and buy a pack of cigarettes for their parents. No questions asked. Clerks knew the families and trusted the request, and tobacco was treated like any other household item. That everyday ritual, seen as harmless then, would now be strictly against the law. Lunch counters added another layer of community life. Places like Woolworths were more than stores, they were gathering spots. Families stopped in for grilled cheese or a milkshake, and teenagers crowded booths after school. Yet even in these cozy settings, a darker reality persisted. In many towns, counters were still segregated, with Black Americans denied service or forced to sit apart. What seemed like a normal part of life to some exposed the deep divisions of the time, habits that were challenged and eventually outlawed through civil rights struggles. Soda fountains stood as another symbol of youthful independence. They were where teenagers flirted, where friends shared a Coke with 2 straws, and where kids tasted freedom for a nickel. To boomers, the soda fountain was both simple and magical, a safe place to belong. Yet the health consequences of sugary drinks weren't yet understood, and what felt innocent then would later be questioned by doctors and nutritionists. Catalogs like Sears and Jacqueminot opened an even bigger window. For families, flipping through hundreds of pages brought the wider world into their living rooms. Children circled toys, parents dreamed over appliances, and orders arrived by mail with excitement. But there were few consumer protections in those years, no guarantees, no easy returns, and little oversight. People trusted the system, even when it failed them. Even money worked differently. Store credit often meant nothing more than a handshake agreement. Families bought on trust, paying when they could, and shopkeepers believed they would. That sense of honor bound communities together, but it also left many vulnerable to debt or unfair treatment. Over time, laws stepped in to regulate credit, protect buyers, and standardized practices that once ran purely on faith. Looking back, it's striking how these habits balanced progress and tradition. Chains brought the future closer, but still carried the warmth of local culture. They offered connection, even as they hinted at the changes to come. For baby boomers, these rituals were part of growing up in a world that still felt small, even as it was rapidly expanding. But soon, those everyday rituals collided with bigger cultural shifts. What started as Main Street shops turned into superstores, and with them, habits that would be outlawed. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the landscape of American shopping had begun to change. Malls and sprawling stores replaced small-town storefronts, offering endless aisles of products under one roof. The shift brought convenience and variety, but it also carried with it a set of everyday practices that would shock us now. What felt like ordinary parts of the shopping experience then are now banned or tightly regulated. One of the most casual, yet dangerous habits was the presence of open alcohol during shopping trips. It wasn't too unusual for parents to sip a beer while driving to the store, or for bottles to be opened before arriving home. Laws around open containers were weak or non-existent in many states, and drinking in public spaces was often overlooked. Shopping centers themselves sometimes turned a blind eye to alcohol in parking lots, where social gatherings spilled out of car trunks. What would be an immediate violation today once blended seamlessly into weekend errands. Smoking was another constant part of the retail world. Shoppers lit cigarettes as they browsed racks of clothing, strolled grocery aisles, or sat on mall benches. Ashtrays were built into store fixtures, and the haze of tobacco hung in the air of nearly every public place. Children stood beside parents as they smoked while trying on shoes or waiting in checkout lines. It was a world where the smell of tobacco was as familiar as the scent of new clothes or buttered popcorn. The thought of lighting up inside a Target or Walmart today feels absurd, but it was once completely normal. Children themselves often faced risks during these outings. Many parents left their kids waiting alone in cars while they shopped, sometimes for hours. Windows cracked open, doors unlocked, and no one questioned the practice. The belief was that children would be fine, especially in the safety of a suburban parking lot. Tragedies did happen, but the habit continued until stricter laws and a changing awareness made it unacceptable. Even the buildings themselves reflected a looser standard. Fire codes and safety regulations were far less strict. Overcrowded aisles, poor exits, and flammable displays were common, and disasters occasionally struck. It took consumer lawsuits and public outcry to push businesses towards safer environments. Each tragedy reminded Americans that convenience came at a cost, and habits once shrugged off as harmless needed to be re-examined. Today, the contrast is striking. Open alcohol in cars is illegal. Smoking indoors is banned. Leaving children unattended is criminalized. And malls follow strict codes to protect shoppers. Consumer lawsuits reshaped the expectations of businesses, making accountability part of the shopping experience. The freedom that once felt natural in those early superstores has been replaced by layers of regulation designed to prevent harm. For baby boomers, those habits are memories, some fond, some sobering. They represent a time when risk was accepted in the name of independence, but also when protections had yet to catch up with modern life. And as businesses changed, the very heart of community life began to fade. The barber closed, the corner store shut down, and along with them, a set of habits vanished. For baby boomers, community life was once built on routines that tied people together, simple rituals that shaped the rhythm of towns. Those small businesses were more than places of commerce. They were gathering points where neighbors caught up, where children learned responsibility, and where trust flowed as naturally as conversation. When those places disappeared, so too did a collection of everyday habits that now feel like stories from another lifetime. One of those habits was the way children moved through the world. Hitchhiking to school, to sports practice, or even to a friend's house was not unusual. A thumb stuck out on the side of the road could easily bring a ride from a neighbor or even a stranger. The risks we recognize today didn't weigh as heavily then. It was simply how kids got around, especially in families where one car had to serve everyone's needs. Parents trusted the road and the community to keep their children safe. That trust extended into the neighborhoods themselves. If a child misbehaved on the street, it wasn't just their parents who stepped in. Neighbors felt entitled to discipline one another's children, delivering scoldings or even punishments. It was a world where the responsibility for raising kids was shared, for better or worse. A parent might come home from work and hear about their child's mischief before the child even had a chance to confess. While that level of involvement reflected close bonds, it also blurred boundaries in ways no longer acceptable today. Independence was built into daily life. Parents often left children home alone for hours, whether to run errands, visit friends, or work long shifts. Kids cooked simple meals, entertained themselves, and learned to navigate boredom without supervision. No one called it neglect, it was expected. Families believed children grew stronger when they handled responsibility early. Today, laws and social expectations frame such practices very differently, often labeling them unsafe or even illegal. Even the way news traveled through communities reflected a time before privacy protections. Gossip was a form of local information, moving from front porches to barbershops to church pews. Everyone seemed to know everyone's business, from financial troubles to family disputes. While this created a tight-knit environment, it also meant little remained private. What once passed as ordinary chatter is now tempered by cultural shifts toward personal boundaries and legal protections. The contrast between then and now is striking. Baby boomers remember a childhood defined by independence, trust, and communal responsibility. Yet many of those same habits are now viewed through the lens of risk and intrusion. What once created belonging can also feel, in hindsight, like exposure to danger or a loss of privacy. The collapse of community habits wasn't just about losing stores or traditions. It marked a deeper change in how Americans saw safety, responsibility, and freedom. But it wasn't just habits tied to neighborhoods. It was America as faith in progress itself. Every gain in safety came at the cost of a habit once considered normal. For baby boomers, growing up meant living in a world where danger was often disguised as routine, and freedom came hand in hand with risk. What felt ordinary back then has since been outlawed or restricted, replaced by rules designed to protect health and life. Looking back, it raises an uncomfortable question. Was that sense of freedom worth what it cost? One of the most common sights in mid-century America was the backyard burn barrel. Families tossed in everything from food scraps to old newspapers and plastics, letting flames turn their trash to smoke. The air carried the smell of burning waste, drifting across neighborhoods as if it were part of the natural order of things. No one worried about toxins or air quality. Today, those same practices are banned in most places, replaced by organized waste collection and environmental protections aimed at curbing pollution. Cars, too, carried hidden dangers. Leaded gasoline powered nearly every vehicle, its fumes filling the air with a substance later proven to harm health, especially in children. Drivers pumped gas without hesitation, never realizing the long-term impact. Laws eventually phased out leaded fuel, but for an entire generation, exposure was simply part of life. The idea that every drive to school or work carried invisible risks is hard to reconcile with the innocence boomers remember. Even play carried hazards that would shock parents today. Lawn darts, with their heavy steel tips, were sold as family games, marketed for backyard fun. Firecrackers were sold openly to children, celebrated as harmless entertainment. These toys left scars and stories, sometimes tragic ones, before safety standards pulled them from shelves. What was once sold as fun now lives in memory as evidence of how casually risk was handled. Adults lived in their own haze of danger. Smoking was permitted almost everywhere: offices, hospitals, airplanes, and even schools. The smell of tobacco clung to desks and hallways, treated as an ordinary part of daily life. Lighting up in the middle of a workday meeting or in a hospital waiting room was not only allowed, it was expected. It would take decades of research and advocacy before the habit was banned from public spaces, leaving behind a stark reminder of how much culture shifted. Cars without seatbelts or airbags completed the picture of risk. Families packed into vehicles, children climbing freely in the back seats, parents turning around to chat while cruising down highways. Accidents were common, but safety laws lagged far behind. Only later did regulations bring mandatory seatbelts, child safety seats, and crash standards. For baby boomers, the freedom of the open road came with unspoken costs, often paid in lives. The story of these habits reveals both the beauty and the danger of progress. Freedom gave people joy, but it also exposed them to risks they didn't understand. Rules brought safety, but they also closed the door on a way of living that felt wide open. And just when habits seemed settled, a new wave of change arrived. Boomers grew up with rotary phones, but the digital world erased habits overnight. The pace of change was faster than anything their parents could have imagined, and many of the daily routines that shaped a baby boomer childhood disappeared almost without warning. Technology didn't just change how people communicated or entertained themselves. It rewrote the rules of privacy, safety, and memory in ways that left an earlier way of life behind. One of the most striking examples was the party line. In many towns, households shared the same telephone line, each home with its own ring. Neighbors could quietly lift the receiver and listen in, turning phone calls into public events whether the caller liked it or not. For children, it was entertainment, sneaking onto the line to hear what grown-ups were saying. For adults, it was just part of life, an accepted lack of privacy in exchange for having a phone at all. Today, the very idea feels outrageous. Laws and technology both ensure private calls, and the thought of eavesdropping on a neighbor's conversation is now a violation of trust and law alike. Television habits changed too. In the 1950s and 60s, cigarette ads filled the airwaves, selling glamour, sophistication, and calm. Movie stars and athletes endorsed brands with a smile, and children grew up watching commercials that made smoking look like a lifestyle. But in 1971, those ads were banned from TV and radio, part of a cultural reckoning that turned a once normal habit into a public health issue. For baby boomers, the memory of cigarette commercials is a reminder of just how much society has shifted. Malls became another symbol of independence. In the 1970s and 80s, kids could spend entire days wandering shopping centers without much supervision. Parents dropped them off with a few dollars and trusted they'd be safe. Groups of teenagers filled arcades, food courts, and record stores, making the mall a second home. Today, safety concerns, stricter rules, and the rise of online shopping have made that kind of freedom rare. What was once an everyday habit now feels like a relic of another world. Even the smallest details of daily life changed. Payphones once stood on nearly every corner, tucked into booths at gas stations, airports, and malls. They were lifelines for children calling home or travelers checking in. Now, with cell phones in every pocket, they vanished almost entirely. Film cameras, too, shaped memory in a way that digital photos never will. Baby boomers grew up with limited snapshots, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, first days of school. Each roll of film carried weight because every picture counted. Today, children grow up with thousands of photos documenting every moment. But the scarcity of those older images gives them a power that endless digital files can't replace. The digital avalanche didn't just bring convenience, it introduced new rules around privacy, safety, and surveillance. It reshaped what could be remembered, what could be shared, and what could be hidden. For baby boomers, the habits erased by digital life stand as proof of how fast the ground beneath them shifted. But as the modern world accelerated, some old habits began finding their way back. Not every baby boomer habit vanished, some are returning with a new twist. Even as technology and modern life pushed old routines aside, there has been a quiet revival of the very habits that once defined community and comfort. What disappeared in the name of progress has begun to re-emerge, reshaped for a new generation searching for connection and authenticity. It's proof that not everything old is gone forever. Some traditions simply wait for the right moment to return. Take food, for example. Farmers markets have sprung up across the country, echoing the old grocery habits of baby boomer childhoods. Instead of rushing through endless supermarket aisles, people once again stroll past stands of fresh produce, homemade pies, and jars of local honey. It mirrors the old days when families knew the farmer who grew their apples or the baker who kneaded their bread. What was once replaced by big box stores has found new life in weekend markets, where shopping feels more like a community event than a chore. Even flavors from the past are resurfacing. Craft sodas with glass bottles and retro labels call back to the days of soda fountains, while diners with chrome stools and jukeboxes recreate the atmosphere of the 1950s. Younger generations, many of whom never lived through those years, line up for milkshakes and burgers served in ways their grandparents remember. Nostalgia has become a business, but it also carries a genuine longing for slower, simpler moments. Music is another place where old habits have returned. Vinyl records, once declared obsolete, now sell in the millions each year. The act of placing a needle on a spinning record, hearing the crackle before the music begins, has a tactile magic that streaming can't replicate. For baby boomers, it's a bridge back to their teenage bedrooms and favorite songs. For younger listeners, it's a discovery of sound and ritual that feels fresh, even though it's decades old. Local barbershops and small cafes are also making a comeback. These spots once anchored communities, where conversations stretched longer than haircuts and cups of coffee lasted all afternoon. After years of franchises and fast service, people are seeking out places that feel personal again. The return of these spaces shows a hunger for face-to-face connection, the kind that once defined neighborhoods in the baby boomer era. This revival isn't accidental. Nostalgia has grown into a cultural force, shaping everything from design trends to entertainment. Old cars are restored, retro fashions cycle back, and even television reboots familiar shows. Beneath the surface, though, is more than marketing. Younger generations are rediscovering habits that brought people together, gave life rhythm, and created memories. What once seemed outdated now feels valuable in a world that often moves too quickly. The return of these roots reminds us that habits aren't just practical, they're emotional. They carry meaning that lingers long after they fade. And when they reappear, they remind us of what mattered most in the first place. Because in the end, these habits were never just about what we did. Not every baby boomer habit vanished. Some are returning with a new twist. Even as technology and modern life pushed old routines aside, there's been a quiet revival of the very habits that once defined community and comfort. What disappeared in the name of progress has begun to re-emerge, reshaped for a new generation searching for connection and authenticity. It's proof that not everything old is gone forever. Some traditions simply wait for the right moment to return. Take food, for example. Farmers markets have sprung up across the country, echoing the old grocery habits of baby boomer childhoods. Instead of rushing through endless supermarket aisles, people once again stroll past stands of fresh produce, homemade pies, and jars of local honey. It mirrors the old days when families knew the farmer who grew their apples or the baker who kneaded their bread. What was once replaced by big box stores has found new life in weekend markets, where shopping feels more like a community event than a chore. Even flavors from the past are resurfacing. Craft sodas with glass bottles and retro labels call back to the days of soda fountains, while diners with chrome stools and jukeboxes recreate the atmosphere of the 1950s. Younger generations, many of whom never lived through those years, line up for milkshakes and burgers served in ways their grandparents remember. Nostalgia has become a business, but it also carries a genuine longing for slower, simpler moments. Music is another place where old habits have returned. Vinyl records, once declared obsolete, now sell in the millions each year. The act of placing a needle on a spinning record, hearing the crackle before the music begins, has a tactile magic that streaming can't replicate. For baby boomers, it's a bridge back to their teenage bedrooms and favorite songs. For younger listeners, it's a discovery of sound and ritual that feels fresh, even though it's decades old. Local barbershops and small cafes are also making a comeback. These spots once anchored communities, where conversations stretched longer than haircuts and cups of coffee lasted all afternoon. After years of franchises and fast service, people are seeking out places that feel personal again. The return of these spaces shows a hunger for face-to-face connection, the kind that once defined neighborhoods in the baby boomer era. This revival isn't accidental. Nostalgia has grown into a cultural force, shaping everything from design trends to entertainment. Old cars are restored, retro fashions cycle back, and even television reboots familiar shows. Beneath the surface, though, is more than marketing. Younger generations are rediscovering habits that brought people together, gave life rhythm, and created memories. What once seemed outdated now feels valuable in a world that often moves too quickly. The return of these roots reminds us that habits aren't just practical, they're emotional. They carry meaning that lingers long after they fade. And when they reappear, they remind us of what mattered most in the first place. Because in the end, these habits were never just about what we did. Habits may fade, but the spirit behind them still lingers in memory. The baby boomer generation grew up in a world that looked very different from today as America, one shaped by freedom, trust, and a belief in community. Children played outside until the streetlights came on. Neighbors borrowed sugar without hesitation, and families piled into cars without a thought about seatbelts. Those habits are gone now, reshaped by laws, safety standards, and cultural change. Yet the feelings they carried, the openness, the connection, the sense of belonging remain etched in the memory of those who lived them. Looking back, it's clear that many of those habits carried risks we would not accept today. Burning trash in the backyard filled the air with pollution. Lawn darts and firecrackers turned play into danger. Smoking in hospitals, offices, and airplanes spread health hazards into every corner of public life. Cars without seatbelts and highways without limits put lives at risk. Progress has rightly banned or restricted these routines, protecting future generations from harm. The losses remind us that some freedoms were more costly than they first appeared. At the same time, the nostalgia is real. The freedom of childhood independence, the trust shared between neighbors, and the slower rhythm of daily life speak to something people still long for. Those memories help shape identity, reminding boomers who they were and showing younger generations what once defined American life. Habits, after all, are more than routines. They are mirrors of culture, reflecting what a society values, tolerates, and expects. The story of baby boomer habits is really the story of balance between freedom and protection, between risk and security, between nostalgia and progress. It asks whether the joy of independence outweighed the dangers, and whether today's safety has come at the cost of something more human. There are no simple answers, only reflections passed down through memory. What never left was the spirit at the center of it all. The desire for connection, for trust, for moments of shared simplicity that remains. It shows up in the return of farmers markets, in the crackle of vinyl records, in the comfort of a local cafe. Progress moves forward, but memory pulls us back, reminding us that even as habits fade, the feelings they carried can always be found again. The baby boomer generation shows us how much life can change and how much of it can stay the same in our hearts. Their habits may be gone, but their spirit still shapes the way America remembers itself. And in the end, that memory is worth holding on to. Which of these baby boomer habits do you remember or wish had stayed? Share your thoughts in the comments.